chosen ones. Be careful. God is warning you about a man. He is. What if a specific man just appeared in your mind the second you read this title, someone whose name you weren't even expecting to think about tonight? What if the reason he came to mind so quickly isn't coincidence, but your own intuition finally getting the chance to say what it's been trying to tell you for weeks? I need you to actually pause here, because if a face or a name surfaced immediately before you even finished reading this sentence, that reaction deserves your full attention right now. You've probably felt this before, that quiet, hard-to-explain unease around a specific man in your life, a tension that doesn't match anything he's actually said or done that you could point to directly. Everyone else around you might seem completely at ease with him, which makes your own discomfort feel even more confusing, even embarrassing to admit out loud. So you've likely kept it to yourself, telling yourself you're overthinking something that probably means nothing. Have you been carrying an unexplainable unease around a specific man, dismissing it because you couldn't point to one clear, obvious reason? Why your body often notices something before your mind can fully name it. Here's something worth understanding. Clearly, intuition doesn't wait for complete, logical proof before it starts sending you signals. It reads small, often unconscious details, a shift in tone, a story that doesn't quite add up, a pattern of behavior your conscious mind hasn't fully connected yet. That processing happens faster than logic can always keep pace with, which is exactly why the feeling often arrives before you can fully explain it. Have you ever sensed something was off about someone long before you could actually put words to what it was? Why you've been making excuses for him specifically? Here's something worth examining honestly. Think about how many times you've quietly explained away this man's behavior, even to yourself, without anyone asking you to defend him. He's just under a lot of pressure right now. I probably read that wrong. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. That specific pattern of repeated excuse-making often reveals exactly how much you already sense, even while actively working to talk yourself out of trusting it. How many times have you quietly made excuses for this specific man's behavior, without anyone else even asking you to? Why this warning isn't about condemning him, it's about protecting you. Here's something important worth clarifying immediately. This message isn't asking you to judge, condemn, or write off a human being entirely. People are complicated, capable of growth, capable of change, and this isn't about deciding someone's permanent worth. This is specifically about protecting your own well-being, your own peace, your own boundaries in this current relationship or interaction, regardless of what his overall character ultimately turns out to be. Can you receive this as protection for your own well-being, rather than as a permanent judgment against his entire character? If this is landing somewhere real in you, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because part 2 goes even deeper into exactly how to protect yourself wisely. Why what he says when no one important is watching matters more than what he says in public. Here's something worth paying attention to specifically. Watch how this man treats people who can't offer him anything, waitstaff, strangers, people in no position to advance his goals or protect his reputation. Public charm is easy to perform. How someone treats people who have no power over their image reveals far more about their genuine character than any polished public version of themselves ever will. Have you actually observed how this man treats people who have no power or usefulness to offer him? Why his reaction to being questioned reveals more than his original explanation. Here's something worth understanding clearly. Pay closer attention to how this man responds when you ask a simple, fair, clarifying question than to whatever his original explanation was. Someone with nothing to hide typically responds to reasonable questions with patience. Someone hiding something often responds with disproportionate defensiveness, deflection, or even turns the conversation around to make you feel guilty for asking in the first place. How has this man responded when you've asked him simple, fair questions with patience or with disproportionate defensiveness? Why you don't need full proof before you're allowed to protect yourself. Here's something worth releasing tonight. The belief that you need complete, undeniable, courtroom-level proof before you're allowed to create distance, set boundaries, or trust your own discomfort around this specific man. Protecting your own peace doesn't require you to build an airtight case first. It simply requires you to honor what you've already genuinely sensed, even while the full picture might still be forming. Are you waiting for complete, undeniable proof before allowing yourself to protect your own peace around this specific man? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because Part 2 continues exploring exactly how to set healthy boundaries without needing to confront or accuse him directly. Why this warning might also be asking you to examine a broader pattern in your own life. Here's something worth considering with real honesty. Sometimes a warning like this isn't only about this specific man. It's also inviting you to examine a broader pattern in your own life. A tendency to override your own instincts repeatedly around certain kinds of men, to give people more chances than genuine wisdom would suggest, to prioritize keeping the peace over protecting your own well-being. If this pattern feels familiar, that's worth addressing directly, regardless of how this specific situation ultimately unfolds. Does this situation reveal a broader pattern in your own life of consistently overriding your instincts around certain kinds of people? Truth for tonight. If a specific man came to mind the moment you read this title, that reaction deserves your genuine attention rather than immediate dismissal. Your intuition has likely been processing signals your conscious mind hasn't fully articulated yet, and the pattern of excuses you've been quietly making might be exactly the evidence you've been overlooking. You don't need complete proof to begin protecting your own peace. If you finally trusted what you've already been sensing about this man, without needing complete proof first, what would you actually do differently starting today? You've been quietly dismissing an unease around a specific man, explaining it away, giving him the benefit of the doubt again and again, even as small inconsistencies kept accumulating. Tonight, you're being asked to finally pay attention to what you've already been sensing, without needing complete proof before you're allowed to protect yourself. This is only Part 1. Part 2 goes deeper into exactly how to set healthy boundaries around this situation without confrontation or accusation. If this message reached something real in you tonight, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because Part 2 continues exactly where this left off. Trust what you've already sensed. You were never overreacting. Chosen ones, be careful. God is warning. In Part 1, we talked about the unease you've been dismissing around this specific man, and why you don't need complete proof before you're allowed to trust what you've already sensed. So today, let's go further. How do you actually protect yourself in this situation practically without needing to confront, accuse, or dramatically cut him off before you're genuinely ready to? Because knowing something feels wrong is one thing. Knowing how to respond wisely is where this becomes real. Are you ready to learn exactly how to protect your peace? Here's what tends to happen even after someone finally acknowledges their own discomfort around a specific man. They feel stuck between two extremes, either continuing exactly as before, pretending nothing feels off, or dramatically confronting and cutting him off entirely. A response that feels disproportionate when you don't yet have a clear, specific reason to justify it. That stuck feeling, caught between two uncomfortable extremes, can leave you paralyzed, doing nothing at all. Have you felt stuck between pretending everything is fine and dramatically confronting him, unsure of any middle path between those two extremes? Why quiet distance is often wiser than direct confrontation. Here's something worth understanding. Clearly, you don't need to confront this man directly, explain your feelings, or demand answers in order to protect yourself. Quiet, gradual distance, sharing less, being less available, keeping conversations more surface level. is often a wiser, more sustainable response than direct confrontation, especially while your own understanding of the situation is still forming. Could you begin creating quiet, gradual distance from this man without needing to confront or explain anything directly? Why you don't owe him a detailed explanation for your changed behavior? Here's something worth releasing immediately. The belief that you owe this man a full, detailed explanation for why you're suddenly less available, less open, less willing to share personal details with him. You're allowed to simply become more private, more measured, more selective, without justifying that shift to anyone, including him specifically. Are you waiting to feel like you owe him an explanation before you're allowed to simply become more private around him? Why limiting what you share protects you more than you realize. Here's something practical worth understanding. One of the most effective, quiet forms of protection available to you is simply limiting the personal information, plans, and vulnerabilities you share with him going forward. Whatever concerns you, whether it's how he uses information, how he influences situations, or how he responds under pressure, becomes far less able to affect you when he simply has less access to your inner life. What specific information or vulnerability have you been sharing with him that you could begin limiting starting now? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next season needs this kind of practical protection. Why watching his consistency over time matters more than judging any single moment. Here's something worth practicing intentionally moving forward, rather than reacting strongly to any single incident. Watch this man's consistency over an extended period of time. Do concerning patterns repeat? Or was your initial unease actually connected to a specific, isolated situation that genuinely resolved? Time reveals patterns that any single moment cannot fully show you, and that patient observation protects you from both premature dismissal and premature overreaction. Are you willing to watch his consistency over time, rather than making a final judgment based on any single incident alone? Why involving one trusted person can help you see this more clearly. Here's something practical worth doing. If you haven't already, share what you've been sensing with one genuinely trusted person in your life. Not to gossip or spread suspicion, but to get honest, outside perspective on whether what you're describing sounds like a genuine pattern worth taking seriously, or whether it might be colored by something else entirely. Trusted outside perspective often catches blind spots your own closeness to the situation might be creating. Is there someone genuinely trusted you could talk to honestly about what you've been sensing regarding this man? Why protecting yourself doesn't require you to become suspicious of every man in your life. Here's something important, worth clarifying as you move through this process. Protecting yourself specifically from this one situation doesn't require you to become generally suspicious or closed off toward every man in your life going forward. This is about discernment specific to this particular relationship, not a wholesale shift in how you approach trust more broadly. Keep your heart open to genuine, trustworthy relationships, while remaining wisely protective in this specific one. Can you protect yourself specifically here, without letting that caution bleed into how you approach every other man in your life? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of balanced wisdom. Why your peace matters more than his comfort with your new boundaries. Here's something worth holding on to firmly as you move forward. If he notices your new distance and reacts with discomfort, confusion, or even pushback, that reaction doesn't obligate you to explain yourself or return to how things were before. Your own peace and protection matter more than managing his comfort with a boundary you have every right to hold, regardless of how he personally feels about it. Are you prepared to hold this boundary even if it makes him visibly uncomfortable or confused? Truth for today. Protecting yourself in this situation doesn't require dramatic confrontation or complete proof. It requires quiet, gradual distance, limited sharing, patient observation of consistency over time, and honest conversation with someone you genuinely trust. Your peace matters more than his comfort with the boundaries you're finally choosing to hold. If you began quietly implementing these protections starting today, how much lighter do you believe you'd feel within just a few weeks? You've learned something today that moves this warning from vague unease into practical protection. That quiet distance is often wiser than confrontation, that limiting what you share protects you more than you realize, and that your peace matters more than managing his comfort with your new boundaries. Stay observant, stay protected. You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing your own peace. If this message reached something real in you today, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because more of these messages are coming exactly when you need them most. Protect your peace quietly. You've already sensed enough to begin. Chosen ones, be careful. God is warning you. What if the man whose name came to mind isn't actually someone dangerous or deceptive at all, and this entire warning was never really about him, but about the wall you've been quietly building against someone who genuinely, patiently cares about you? What if the discomfort you've been feeling isn't intuition protecting you from harm, but fear protecting you from something else entirely, the vulnerability of finally letting a good man actually get close? Tonight, I want you to consider a possibility this series hasn't fully addressed yet. One that requires real honesty with yourself before we go any further. You've spent this entire journey learning to trust your unease, and that instinct genuinely matters. But there's another possibility worth examining honestly tonight. Sometimes the specific discomfort you feel around a man isn't actually about him being untrustworthy at all. It's about your own history, your own old wounds, quietly convincing you that any man who gets genuinely close, any man who's consistently kind, any man who actually shows up reliably, must eventually reveal himself as dangerous too, simply because that's what happened before, with someone else. Could your discomfort around this man actually be rooted in your own history, rather than in anything genuinely concerning about who he actually is? Why people who've been hurt by men before often subconsciously sabotage healthy connection. Here's something worth understanding with real honesty. People who've experienced genuine betrayal or hurt from men in the past often develop a subconscious pattern of testing, doubting, or pulling away from healthy male relationships, simply because healthy connection feels unfamiliar, even threatening, compared to the dysfunction their nervous system learned to expect. That pattern isn't weakness. It's a protective mechanism that sometimes protects you from exactly the wrong thing. Have you noticed a pattern in your own life of doubting or pulling away specifically from men who treat you well and consistently? Why consistency can actually feel suspicious to someone who's never experienced it before? Here's something worth examining honestly about this specific man. Has his behavior actually been inconsistent, evasive, or defensive the way we discussed earlier in this series? Or has it actually been remarkably steady, patient, and reliable? And it's precisely that steadiness that feels unfamiliar and slightly unsettling, simply because you're not used to trusting something that doesn't eventually show cracks. Has this man's behavior actually been inconsistent and concerning, or has it been steady and reliable in a way that simply feels unfamiliar to you? Why testing someone repeatedly eventually exhausts even the most patient man? Here's something worth considering with real care. If you've been unconsciously testing this man, creating distance, watching for cracks that never actually appear, expecting him to eventually prove your unease correct, that pattern, sustained long enough, eventually exhausts even someone with genuinely patient, good intentions. You could accidentally push away exactly the kind of consistent, trustworthy man this entire series has been teaching you to recognize, simply because you couldn't yet trust what genuine reliability actually feels like. Could your own testing and distancing eventually push away someone who's actually been consistently trustworthy this entire time? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because this specific reframe might be exactly what protects a genuinely good relationship in your life right now. Why this doesn't mean every unease you've ever felt was wrong. Here's something important worth clarifying immediately, because this reframe isn't meant to undo everything the earlier parts of this journey established. This isn't suggesting you should abandon genuine discernment or dismiss every instinct as simply old trauma talking. Some unease genuinely does reflect real red flags, exactly as we discussed in earlier parts. This is simply inviting you to honestly examine this specific situation with both possibilities held simultaneously, rather than assuming only one explanation could possibly be true. Can you hold both possibilities honestly, genuine discernment and old trauma-based fear, without immediately assuming only one explanation applies here? Why the specific question worth asking is whether his actions or your history is driving the discomfort. Here's something practical worth doing tonight, a specific diagnostic question worth sitting with honestly. When you examine your discomfort around this man, can you point to specific, observable actions of his that genuinely concern you? Inconsistencies, defensiveness, evasion? Or, when you're honest, does the discomfort trace back more directly to memories of someone else entirely, an old wound this man hasn't actually caused, but simply happens to resemble in some superficial way? When you trace your discomfort honestly, does it point to this man's actual actions, or to memories of someone else entirely? Why healing this old wound matters regardless of how this specific situation resolves. Here's something worth committing to. Regardless of which explanation actually applies here, if you discover that old wounds are genuinely shaping how you receive even healthy, trustworthy men, that discovery deserves its own genuine attention and healing, separate from whatever happens with this specific relationship. Unaddressed, that pattern will keep showing up again and again with different men until you actually address the original wound underneath it. Are you willing to genuinely address this old wound, regardless of how this specific situation with this specific man ultimately resolves? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of honest healing. Why both truths can coexist without canceling each other out. Here's something worth holding. As this reflection nears its close, you can genuinely trust your discernment about men who are actually harmful, exactly as the earlier parts of this series taught you, while also genuinely recognizing when your own history is coloring your perception of a man who's actually safe. Both skills matter. Both deserve development. Neither one cancels out the legitimate value of the other. Can you commit to developing both skills, trusting genuine discernment, while also recognizing when old wounds are distorting your perception? Truth for today. This man might genuinely be someone requiring the careful protection this entire series has described. Or he might actually be someone consistently trustworthy, someone your own old wounds have made unnecessarily difficult to fully receive. Tonight isn't asking you to abandon discernment. It's asking you to examine this specific situation honestly enough to know which truth actually applies here. If you honestly examined this specific relationship tonight, tracing your discomfort back to its actual source, what do you believe you'd genuinely discover? You've learned something today that adds crucial nuance to this entire journey. That sometimes unease reflects genuine red flags worth protecting yourself from, and sometimes it reflects old wounds distorting your perception of someone genuinely safe and trustworthy. Examine this honestly. Both explanations matter. Only one applies here, and you're the only one who can discover which. If this message reached something real in you today, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because more of these messages are coming exactly when you need them most. Trust your discernment, but also examine your history. The truth is waiting for your honesty. What if the exact timing of this warning, arriving now before anything irreversible has actually happened, is itself the clearest evidence of how deeply you're loved? What if a warning that came too late would have cost you far more than the discomfort of hearing it now, and the fact that you're receiving this while there's still time to respond wisely is genuinely one of the most tender gifts you've been given this entire season? Tonight, we close this journey by understanding not just what you've been shown about this man, but why the timing of that warning matters more than almost anything else we've discussed. You've probably wondered, at some point across this journey, why this warning arrived now specifically rather than earlier, before you'd already invested time, trust, and emotional energy into this relationship. That wondering can carry a specific frustration, wishing you'd known sooner, wishing you could have avoided the discomfort entirely, wishing the warning had arrived before you'd already given him as much access to your life as you have. Have you wished this warning had arrived earlier, before you'd already invested significant time and trust into this specific relationship? Why a warning that arrives before devastation is always mercy, even when it feels late? Here's something worth understanding clearly. Regardless of how much time has already passed, this warning arrived before complete devastation occurred, before irreversible damage was done, before the situation reached a point where recovery would have been significantly harder. That timing, whatever frustration it carries, is genuine mercy. The alternative, no warning at all, or a warning arriving only after everything had already fallen apart completely, would have cost you far more. Can you recognize this timing as genuine mercy, even if part of you wishes it had arrived even earlier than it did? Why late warnings tend to arrive as devastating revelation rather than gentle guidance. Here's something worth understanding about how this specific kind of situation typically plays out when warning arrives too late. Instead of a quiet, internal unease you have time to examine and respond to wisely, the truth arrives as sudden, devastating revelation, discovered evidence, a painful confrontation, a betrayal fully exposed after significant damage has already been done. That version of learning the truth costs infinitely more than the version you're actually experiencing right now. Can you imagine how much more devastating this situation could have become had the truth only arrived after significant damage was already done? Why this early warning gives you something late warnings never offer. Here's something worth appreciating specifically about this exact timing. Because this warning arrived early, you have the ability to respond with genuine dignity, quiet, wise protection, thoughtful boundaries, patient observation, rather than the reactive, devastated response that typically accompanies discovering betrayal only after significant harm has occurred. That dignity, the ability to handle this situation calmly rather than in crisis, is a genuine gift this specific timing has made possible. How has the early timing of this warning allowed you to respond with more dignity and calm than a late discovery ever could have? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because more of these truths are waiting for whenever your next season needs this kind of grounded perspective. Why God's warnings often arrive as whispers rather than dramatic announcements. Here's something worth understanding about the specific nature of how this warning likely arrived in your own life. It probably wasn't a dramatic, undeniable event. It was more likely a quiet, persistent unease, a subtle discomfort you almost dismissed multiple times before finally paying attention. That quiet, whisper-like quality isn't a lesser form of warning. It's actually the most common, most consistent way genuine guidance tends to reach people. Gentle enough to be ignored, but persistent enough to eventually be heard by anyone genuinely listening. Did this warning arrive to you as a quiet, persistent whisper rather than a dramatic, undeniable event? Why ignoring this specific mercy would cost you more than the discomfort of receiving it. Here's something worth being honest about as this journey nears its close. The discomfort of receiving this warning, having to examine an uncomfortable possibility about someone in your life, having to implement quiet boundaries, having to sit with uncertainty, is genuinely smaller than the cost of ignoring this specific mercy entirely and allowing the situation to develop without any protective response at all. The temporary discomfort of heeding this warning protects you from a significantly larger cost down the road. Does the temporary discomfort of heeding this warning feel worth it compared to the potential cost of ignoring it entirely? Why this mercy reveals something specific about how much you're actually watched over. Here's something worth receiving with genuine comfort tonight. The fact that this specific warning reached you at exactly this moment before devastating consequences occurred reveals something deeply personal about how closely and specifically your life is actually being watched over. This wasn't generic, impersonal guidance. It was specific, timed precisely for your exact situation, arriving exactly when you needed it most. Does it change how you feel about your own life, realizing how specifically and personally this warning was actually timed for your exact situation? If this is landing somewhere real, that's exactly why this series exists. Subscribe now, because there's more waiting for whenever your next chapter needs this kind of personal, specific care. Why you can now trust future warnings with greater confidence, having witnessed this one's mercy. Here's something worth carrying forward as this entire journey concludes. Having walked through this experience, recognized this warning's mercy, and responded wisely rather than ignoring it, you're now equipped with genuine, personal evidence that future warnings, whenever they arrive in your life, deserve the same genuine attention and trust. This experience becomes a permanent reference point for every future moment where quiet unease tries to reach you again. How will this specific experience change how quickly and confidently you respond to future warnings in your own life? The final truth. This warning arrived exactly when it needed to, before devastating consequences occurred, before recovery would have been significantly harder, giving you the ability to respond with dignity rather than crisis. That specific timing wasn't accidental. It was mercy, personal and precise, revealing exactly how closely your life continues to be watched over, even in the quiet, ordinary moments where unease first begins to whisper. If you fully receive this entire experience as genuine mercy, rather than frustrating inconvenience, how would that change the way you carry gratitude forward into whatever comes next? Series finale. You've walked through this entire 5-part journey, from the moment a specific man first crossed your mind, through learning to trust unexplainable unease, through practical protection, through honest self-examination of your own history, and now finally understanding why this warning's exact timing was genuine mercy rather than mere coincidence. You weren't warned too late. You were warned exactly on time. If this series meant something real to you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, because there's always another message waiting for exactly the moment you need it most, and this channel isn't finished showing up for you yet. Mercy arrived on time. Now walk forward, protected, discerning, and grateful.